Hello and welcome to the program. Among other laws, the Ukrainian parliament recently studied a bill on national security to bring Ukraine closer to NATO standards. This draft law follows bill on the reintegration of Donbas, among others. Now we are joined in our studio today to discuss the parliament's work and President Poroshenko's recent Q&A session by Ukrainian MP Andriy Vadaturskyi. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
So the idea has been expressed by President Poroshenko to put NATO, the path toward NATO and the EU standards in constitution. But meeting NATO and EU Western standards, well, that means that Ukraine should meet at least those standards, and effectively, how do you plan to do that? How does?
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, I don't see implementation of the standards, NATO standards, for example, into the constitution. And I'm really curious to see what kind of propositions the administration of the president will come to the parliament. And of course, we will consider all the proposition or draft of the laws, and the parliament will decide. But what we think and what we do is we prepare the map of all the Euro integration law, which we think should be sufficient to meet the standards. For example, the Cabinet of Ministers selected, I think, 57 drafts of the law, which will help to meet the goal which we signed, I think, a couple of years ago with EU-Ukraine agreement, association agreement. And for example, of course, in every area, we should accept the standards, accept the law in order to synchronize, in order to meet simply the standards of European Union.
Now, this law and the path toward EU and NATO also respond and follows, this law on the reintegration of Donbas. But the war in Donbas is, of course, a threat. But how significant is that threat compared to corruption? Because a recent survey, for example, made by a US think tank, said that 40% of Ukrainians said, quote, corruption was among the top 3 problems facing the country. And 43% of the people asked in this survey see war in Donbas as a significant threat. How to deal with this problem?
Well, first of all, with regards to the corruption, I agree that it's a #1 problem in Ukraine, because the rest, the state and people can cope and can solve the problems. But with the corruption that is everywhere, on every stage, is simply stop the growth, stop the performance of the country, prohibits the reforms. There are 2 ways of dealing with this problem. First of all, we should complete the circle, which is called anti-corruption organization. We created a police, we created NABU, the prosecutor office, which is dealing with the top corruption cases. And third, we need to finish the reform with creation of anti-corruption court.
Sure, maybe that's for verbal support, but what about the real strategy here? Like NABU, like Ukraine has been under attack around, and there has been controversy around NABU and around the effective creation of this court. What is realistically implemented?
Well, the reality is that in case they catch a criminal and they go with the case into the court, and that's it. That's the end of the story, because the corruption is in the court, and there is no punishment for the breach of the law. And that is why we need to create a special court which is going to have the reputation and is going to deal exactly with these cases. Because to fight the corruption, it's in all the stages, everywhere in Ukraine it's impossible. You need to start somewhere. But again, I don't believe that the creation of any court or any courts in Ukraine will lead to end the fight with the corruption. First of all, the parliament, the president, the cabinet of ministers have to concentrate on creation of the law which kills the corruption at the source of the corruption. Source of the corruption. And second issue is the economic growth of the country, because when the country is poor, when the people are poor, you know, it's very difficult to fight the corruption.
That's interesting that you raised that kind of problem and this idea of threatening the corruption at the criminal case. Because recently there has been a really mediatic criminal case. I'm speaking about the Trukhanov case, and
exactly.
Yeah. So in that case, Mr. Trukhanov has been brought in court and has been bailed out by Ukrainian MPs. How do you explain that?
Well, that's exactly the problem, and that is why we need to fight the. I will give you just one example, because in our country with 40 million people we have 360,000 bureaucrats. 360,000 bureaucrats, out of them 60,000 are fighting against the corruption. And you say correctly that we have corruption on a very high level. I'm just giving you an example of Japan, where living, I think, 130 million people and only 9,000 bureaucrats. So that's the size. And that is why we need to have a privatization program to reduce the influence of those bureaucrats on the business, because every bureaucrat is killing 5 working places in the business. So that is why the less bureaucrats we have, the less we have corruption in Ukraine. And that is why we need to have decentralization, we need to have liberalization, and we need to reduce the taxes, because if the country is poor and if there is a high level of corruption, so the first aid is reduce the taxes and liberalization for the business, and at the end we need to create the middle class. Without that, you know, even 20,000 more employees who are going to fight the corruption in Ukraine will not help. They will dig into the problem, but will not be able to solve it.
Now let's focus on Ukroboronprom for a minute, which has been criticized for its lack of transparency in the recent draft of recent draft on the national security law. Well, basically 95% of procurements of arms and defense equipment in Ukraine is hidden from public scrutiny and goes through non-competitive procedures. Now, transparency, if it's about meeting NATO standards, is key, at least on Western standards in those sectors. How does the Ukrainian government intend to pick and choose which sector is transparent or not?
Well, I agree that the standards should be the same everywhere, but I'm not sure that, for example, all the purchases or all the procurement from Ukroboronprom has to be very transparent, you know, because some securities have to be honored as well. You know, it's very difficult for me to give an expertise on that. But of course, for example, petrol, you know, it's why not to go via a very well-performing program Prozora, for example, which allowed to have, you know, to satisfy decentralization when we give power, more power on the to the people, to the places, to the regional, and that is why they could be independent in purchases. And this program is allowing them to perform those purchases, and that is why I don't see any problem just to do the analysis, to do the audit of the all purchases of Ukroboronprom, and decide which category is, has the risk for the security of the country, and which are not. And those who are not, of course, has to be public, transparent, and it's very simple to do it via the same system.
Well, we'll go that a bit to the simplicity a bit after. But how do you balance the private, concerning procurements, and I really want to focus on Ukrbоронпром now, how do you balance private interest and public safety interest in that case?
In Ukrbоронпром, there is no, there's security service that has to evaluate, whether it has the risk for the public security or not. Because for the army to buy special equipment, unique equipment, for example, or maybe we have a monopoly which is producing, for example, we have only one plant that is producing tanks, for example, or some special weapons, so you don't have a choice. And that is why, it's very difficult to do the tender, and and that is why maybe it's the reason why it's not that transparent. But in this case, there is a different law which applies to kind of monopoly trading, monopoly purchases, and there is an audit, this security service that have to monitor, because it's an army, it's a security for the whole Ukraine.
Now, we talked about monopoly. That's really interesting that you raised this issue, because this new draft law, President Petro Poroshenko might have control, a lot of more control over this security and this defense system. Why now? And war has been going on for years. What will it really change, and why now? And last, maybe more important, how to ensure there's no conflict of interest?
Well, it's very difficult to comment why it is now, because sometimes we adopt the law which is already like a couple of years late, and only recently you saw quite a hot debate in the parliament with regards to territory in Donbas, which and whether we should call Russia aggressor or not. And it's already like 3-4 years after the start of the war, and we are still having the discussions because it's a very complex issue. And from the legal prospects, but we voted, we accepted that who is the aggressor and who is occupying our land.
My question was more about the fact that Mr. Poroshenko will effectively have now control over the security and defense system. Is there any risk of conflicts of interest once and again? And also, I just wanted to focus on something else. The EU and IMF are waiting for this reform, and they're waiting for an open and transparency. And the US even planned to cut 80% of Ukraine, of help to Ukraine. So now, except it's been 4 years and Maidan happened, these reforms could have been led way earlier, except from talking what actually happens now, 1 year before the election.
Well, the speed, of course, everybody is expecting to do it quicker rather than later. But, what we say in Ukraine, that the biggest enemy for Ukrainians is the time. And that is why it's very difficult to say whether, we were successful in adopting the different laws. But with regards to the first part of your question, I think there is no conflict of interest, because it's the president, it's his duty to control the army, because it's constitutional. according to the Ukrainian constitution, Ukrainian president is the head of the army in case there is a war.
Well, thank you for joining us in the studio. It was a pleasure to have you today. That was Ukrainian MP Andriy Vadaturskyi. Thank you for joining us.